I was going to ask the gentleman whether safety on construction sites was part of the metric that they would use in terms of selecting a vendor, but I didn't do it, but I imagine it is. And it's part of my story, in fact, in the story of the development of our company, WorkCare, and I don't want to sound like an advertisement, but I've been in business about 35 years. I'm trained as a preventive medicine specialist. So back in those days, safety was, OSHA started in 1971, so safety was becoming an issue. Now, safety is primary prevention. Prevent the accident from occurring. And back when I got first started, the safety guy was typically the last guy that got injured. So he was injured so bad he couldn't do his regular job, so they tried to train him as a safety professional. They figured he knew something about safety because he had gone through the injury management process. Well, we've come a long way. And I've been talking to some of the other people who are exhibiting here and know that some of them have devoted a lot of resources to safety at work and safety in grain elevator construction and management, farming, co-op management, etc. And these are complex operations, I've come to learn. Just the last few nights, I went to visit a poultry processing plant about an hour and a half east of here. And my customer has the unglorified job of cleaning up the facility between shifts. So they have 4 hours to turn this thing totally around and make it FDA clean. And I had a greater appreciation for the challenges that these people faced and the accomplishments and the pride that they took in just these menial tasks. It was really wonderful to see. But at any rate, I'm getting back to the story about prevention. Secondary prevention is typically when primary prevention fails, you try to mitigate the consequences, and that's what I'm trying to do. As an occupational physician, primary prevention as it relates to this whole farm area would be, the grain dust diseases that farmers used to get many years ago, the John Deere ear, which would be hearing loss in, I think the left ear from trying to see how straight the harrows were from plowing back in the 30s. We still have noise-related hearing loss. I imagine the other night this company uses a lot of handheld hoses, so they have ergonomic issues, spraying down at heights, again, shoulder issues. In your 50s, you don't have that shoulder strength to maintain that angle for a long time. But also, they weren't wearing their hearing protection all the time. I saw a few people not doing that, and you're creating a lot of noise with this. And finally, they had safety glasses, but we went into one area of the plant where the boilers were turned on and the heat occurred, and our safety glasses fogged up in a matter of 30 seconds. So they had to remove them to be more safe. So, again, these are sort of little nuances that I observed that night that might help. Here, I'm off the page, obviously. But during the mid-'90s, so I got my start helping an engineering firm become an environmental engineer. And by that I meant we had to take it. Now the government had decided the dirt was dirty. They were doing the same job for many years, but because it was toxic, so quote unquote, they now had to abide by a host of regulations, which included medical exams. So I set up a procedure for doing this for companies with multiple operations nationwide. And then in the mid-'90s, one of them came to me and he says, this big major oil firm is going to be reducing the number of subcontractors they have, and they have 38 engineering firms, and they're migrating to 8. And one of the metrics they're going to use is health and safety performance. And at the time, they had a recordable rate of 1.1. And the desired metric from the oil firm was 0.08, or 0.8. So that was a big gap. And so they engaged me to help them, manage these injuries a little better. And I knew from my practice in Anaheim, California, where I had a busy industrial clinic, that a lot of the injuries we saw were very trivial. But I also learned something else, that the people that returned to work immediately after that injury always did better. both physically and mentally, and they made a quicker recovery. So I said, okay, to this customer, I said, I think I understand a little bit about managing injuries. Perhaps we could design some preventive programs and make it better. So I said, when an injury occurs, you bring him to the doctor and then notify me, and I'll call the doctor. And I'll try to educate the doctor on, the aspect that they should use, best practice. But I would tell that doctor, hey, if you return him to work, he's going to do a lot better. So we had a modicum of success with that. But then I came across a military triage model, and it was a learning that the military had discovered about 100 years ago, World War I. Great Britain had 200,000 permanently disabled veterans. And they were trying to figure out, well, why were all of these guys disabled? And what the commonality they discovered was that everyone was repatriated back to Great Britain for treatment. So they were removed from the battlefield. And they also were being treated for a condition that we wouldn't even recognize today as a medical condition called shell shock. So using that, the U.S. military had devised a program for the Second World War that they call SPICE. And that's the way they manage battlefield injuries. So I came across this tool, and I applied it to this company, and their results were amazing, and they got down. Today, I think their recordable rate is 0.3, and their days away cases are 0.1. Now, does anyone know in the room what those metrics mean? It'll give me a sense of where I should direct my comments. One person, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So there may be some benefit to listening. So I get to help, I get a lot of employers, and me, even as an employer, I have 200 employees. We've had 3 injuries. And my XMOD, does everyone understand what XMOD is? It's how insurance companies determine your premium. So it's hours of payroll, and then they start, if you're a new business, they'll have your SIC code, and they'll say, well, for this industry, this is what we know, and this is what you charge. If your payroll go up, you'll get a balanced bill. Now, if you have injuries, your XMOD goes up, and so your rating factor goes up. So I've had 3 injuries. They were all bad employees that we tried to terminate, and of course they feigned these injuries in my humble opinion. But the insurance company didn't necessarily agree with me, and they started to treat them, and some of them cases are still open, so my XMOD goes up. I imagine that a lot of you as employers have experienced the same sort of frustration. So I'm going to write the book someday. It's called Nature, Extent, and Other Things, because in injury management, it's nothing got to do with the nature of the injury. It's nothing got to do with the extent of the injury. It's all the psychosocial babble that goes along with these management of this injury. And that's what you end up paying for in work-related injuries. So I've designed this talk to help employers understand the broader meaning and scope of worker injury management. And hopefully in the next 30 minutes you'll get some benefit from listening. The 3 takeaways I have today for you are that employers can take a more active role in the management of worker injuries. I mean, even in the best prevention programs, you are going to have events. And so you have to have a strategy and a way of dealing with them, because what's been happening now doesn't work, as you'll see from the presentation. The second takeaway would be to understand just that psychosocial aspect. I'm not going to make doctors out of you in the next 30 minutes, but you will understand a little bit more of what tends to drive these things. Just the understanding, recently a publication, this country, we use more opiate medications than 90% of the opiates made in the world are used in the United States. So are we sicker or more painful than the rest of the world, or are we just more habitually using opiates? The latter is we prescribe more opiates, enough that every man, woman, and child in the country would have a 6-week dose every year. And I don't take mine, so one of you out there is taking double that dose. So, and the startling results is that a workers' comp claim duration of that case is going to be open 90 days longer if one opiate prescription was prescribed during the course of that treatment. So it does have an effect on cost and productivity. So that's the second understanding, psychosocial. And the third is that employers can take a more look at different strategies for how they're doing business today in the area of injury management and make some subtle changes that would be helpful. Okay, so what are these 10 pitfalls? If we just go into them real quick, and I'll spend a few seconds on each. The first one is not understanding the whole workers' comp industry. It's a business like your own business, and it's designed to make money. So if you don't take an active role in it, you'll end up being a victim. The second one is that there are a lot of different silos within your own company. I don't know how big your organizations are, but it's not unusual for me to be dealing with employers with 100,000 employees. And, they have a risk management department, they have an HR department, they have a legal department, they have a return to work department, and none of them speak to each other. But yet they all have the same objective of managing this person's injury. So breaking down those silos and having more dialogue is the second pitfall. The third is not using the correct providers. The fourth pitfall is using providers that don't have standard treatment protocols. The fifth pitfall is having an unsupportive company culture and return to work, an absence of return to work. The sixth one is not understanding all of these delayed recovery processes and the psychosocial aspect. The seventh is having unrealistic expectations among your workforce of what workers' comp means to them, and fraud and abuse would be another term for that. And number 8 is not planning for successful return to work. Number 9 pitfall is ineffective use of case management. Hopefully you understand what that means. And number 10 is lack of innovation. So in the first pitfall, you really need to understand and study how insurance works. I mean, Warren Buffett isn't rich because he took on a lot of unnecessary risk. And the whole concept of insurance doesn't exist in workers' comp. It's just a balanced billing or an adjustment of your premium. There's nobody taking your risk. So you shouldn't defer to the insurance company on making all decisions, because if you do, you'll end up paying for it. You have to manage your insurer just like any other cost structure in your company. You have to understand how this whole concept of AOE, number 3 down there, has the injury truly occurred at work? A lot of people come to work and then they develop back pain. It doesn't necessarily mean just they're at work, but that the back pain is a result of work. And that's the legal standard that has to exist for it to be work-related. It has to arise out of employment or occur during the course of employment. In other words, something at work caused it. And a lot of the conditions I see, the guy would have developed back pain or neck pain or shoulder pain even if he had never been at work. So make sure your insurance company is on board. And if you have questionable claims and you hear about a person through the grapevine that, this might have occurred on Saturday or Sunday, and he comes in Monday morning and reports it, you need to get that information to your insurance company before they accept that as a legitimate claim. You know the rules. I know you operate in a lot of different states. The rules do vary by state. But even in states that allow you to not allow you to select your network or your own providers, you can do a lot to help them get the better providers. You do need to understand that some of these other areas, like what does family medical leave have to do with workers' comp? What does Americans with Disabilities Act have to do with workers' comp? It has a lot to do when the person returns to work after that absence or injury. The primary thing you have to do with pitfall number 1 is to make sure take your claims adjuster to lunch. Understand their business, develop a relationship with them, and set expectations about how you're going to manage claims. some of our customers have a every other week teleconference with their claims adjusters, and they review the injuries and claims that have occurred in the preceding 2 weeks. And then quarterly, they have a sit-down, face-to-face claim review where they go over every claim and they see what the adjuster has done in the intervening 90 days to get that claim to closure. Because, again, it's your money that the insurance company is using during that interval that claim remains open. And that's how they make their money. And of course, they do have to be profitable, but they don't have to do it at your expense. The second one, you'll see some grain silos there. This isn't really talking about your business. It's more talking about a lack of integration within the company. It's not unusual for an injured worker to have to deal with HR, legal, benefits, et cetera, and the safety professional. So I think you all have to be on the same page and talking the same language when dealing with that injured worker so that there's no opportunity for unmet expectations. Some of our best customers get together yearly and they exchange information on the benchmarking and who's doing what are they doing, how are they achieving their results, how are they getting their TRR rate down to 0.3. So a lot of it that I see the migration towards is aligning goals. So the senior leadership sets a goal for these departments to work better together in the area of workers' comp management and have a shared responsibility. So what do you use within your company as a measuring metric? Do you use leading and lagging indicators? Do you talk about things such as company culture? Do you talk about supervisor training as it relates to dealing with injured worker? You do need to look at the whole high-cost areas. There are probably some states that are better doing business. I know employers that I work with don't speak very friendly about California. They don't talk in polite terms when they're talking about Ohio state comp or the state of Washington. And these are monopolistic states that they run a monopoly on workers' comp. There's no real competition, so they can set rates and make decisions without regard to their customers. So you do need to have a better understanding of what these injuries cost. Nationwide, the National Safety Council says a medical treatment case for a work-related injury, the average cost is $36,000. And the average cost per employee per year for just coverage under workers' comp is about $1,300. So the customer I went to see in Missouri the other night, their average cost per year is $200. So they're doing much, much better than the benchmark. I was surprised that the safety professional knew that number. But he told me, and I asked him how come he knew it. He said that when they're bidding work, they have to be aware of the hourly rate that they have to charge for workers' comp. Same in construction. I'm sure you have to know that number. And if you're not doing very well, it'll be higher than your competitors. So here's the thing I think that's in most of your control of all of these 10 pitfalls is finding proper providers. It's not unusual when you roll into a small town, do a construction project, that you just don't think of who you're going to use in the event of an injury. And you inevitably will end up in an emergency room. And what are you going to get in an emergency room? Standard treatment is opiate prescription, take 2 weeks off of work, and see your own doctor before returning to work. So there are alternatives. There are a reason an emergency room has to provide opiate prescriptions. They have a rating entity called Joint Commission. And one of the negative ratings would occur if an injured worker had to come back to that same emergency room within a 48-hour period for pain management. So to avoid that, they just give you a prescription for opiates, and they give it to almost everyone. And the safety professionals are pulling their hair out, trying to get those practices negated. It would be better to use a bit more preventive approach and find a provider in that community that specializes in occupational health care. They have better training in understanding return to work. They know the metrics related to opiate use. They may even have a better appreciation for trying to keep injuries and non-OSHA recordable, which would mean a lot to you and your safety professional because they could classify that event as a first aid case. And there is a big disparity if it's a medical treatment case, but it is not a lost time case. The average cost nationwide is only $8,000. So there's a big cost difference if a person goes out of work as a result of work injury. The other part about, much like my visit to the poultry processing plant the other night, when employees see a provider coming to their work environment, that as occupational physicians typically do, their trust and belief and confidence in that physician increases if they have to see him for a work-related injury. So if you have large projects in areas and can identify an occupational health physician, it would make good business sense to try to get that physician to come and visit that work area and be seen in that work area. Then when an event occurs, the injured worker will have better trust in that provider. And even in states where employees have this right to go to see their own provider, it's often, if the safety professional or HR person could suggest to the injured worker that this other provider might be more convenient, might be more accessible, it would make it a lot more easy for you to manage that injury, obviously. If you don't know of ready providers in a community, talk to some of your competitors, talk to some other businesses. Find an outside expert that may know of providers that you could use that are trusted resources. You can easily do this over the phone, by just interviewing the provider. And the key questions you would want to know is, how does that give them a hypothetical situation and ask the provider, how would you manage this particular case? And if the person doesn't talk about return to work, you're probably in the wrong environment. Because inevitably an occupational physician will link his treatment plan with return to work, because knowing that people who return to work always get better quicker and more completely. You could also ask that provider about the next pitfall, which is what protocols they use. Two injured workers with the same condition will be provided different levels of care, different treatments, and will have different outcomes, because nobody uses the same hymn sheet. Some will use a back brace, some will do x-rays. Both measures have no application in the treatment of back pain. Some will immediately rush to an MRI, and if that happens, you're going to have trouble, because MRIs are so sensitive, they're going to find something wrong, and 60% of these people in this room, if you had an MRI, you're going to be diagnosed with a herniated disc, even though you may not have had back pain. So when you put a person who has back pain and tell him he has a herniated disc, you're inevitably going to cause that case to end up in some sort of surgical procedure. The person isn't going to be convinced he can get better by just using the standard protocol, which is ice, Advil, and activity as tolerated. That's just, so if providers would use some of these standard protocols, the outcomes would be a lot better, and they'd be a lot more cheaper, obviously, for the consumer, but they'd be much more effective. We talked a little bit about supervisors, and in this situation, it does pay to be nice. There has been studies showing how supervisors respond to injured workers goes a long way in determining how these cases end up. If the supervisor is belligerent and not empathetic and accusatory, saying, you idiot or whatever, why did you do such an unsafe act? That will just drive the case a little bit more negative and adds a dimension to the psychology in that. Similarly, if the supervisor ignores the complaint and says, hey, just shrug it off, man up, as they might do in Wyoming, or cowboy up, you again don't have the proper level of empathy, and the employees in those situations often go out to prove just how injured they are and don't show up at work the next day. There was a study done in Boeing many years ago where they looked at what causes people to file workers' comp claims. And they looked at all the variables you could imagine, such as the type of work, the weight they had to lift, how long they had to lift it for. And the common finding was that the relationship between the employee and the supervisor was the key determinant on whether a person filed workers' comp claim. If that relationship was fractured in some way through a bad performance review, or they just didn't like each other, didn't get on, then the injured worker was more likely to file a workers' comp claim. So, like I said, it does pay to have a clear approach, how you're going to deal with this, how you're going to train people to be nice, and it will come back in terms of better management. Okay, we've talked a little bit about this, so I won't dwell on that one. Number 5 is company culture. It sort of builds on what I just said about the Boeing study. If people have a culture of taking time away from work for injuries and not reporting to work on a Monday, taking early absences on a Friday, you're setting a pattern that other employees will look at, and if it's not managed or addressed, they'll follow suit. That's the way culture tends to work within organizations. Delayed recovery let me explain what that means. That means that an injury that you would have expected to return to work doesn't return to work, or an injury that you had expected, like shoulder pain, for example. The typical shoulder strain takes about 3 to 4 weeks to get better. But if your particular injured employee is out of work for 6 months, 8 months, or maybe he's waiting for the snow to thaw and the project to resume in May, so he takes off in the previous October, you're really dealing with a case of delayed recovery. It's nothing got to do with the nature of his injury. It's more got to do with the psychosocial aspects. And in the example I pointed out, it's the lack of work, or the lack of work indoors, and challenges that employee may have in obtaining work outside of the seasonal, typical seasonal work that goes on. So to avoid these things, again, you need an early reporting process. You need to be aware of sort of things that typically can result in more reporting of accidents. There was a study done among French railroad workers, and they looked at why do people tend to be repeat offenders, the frequent faller club that we call. And they found that 29% of employees report more than one injury in a 4-year study period. And the things they had in common were, number 1, they were physically inactive outside of work. The second one was they were smokers. And the third one was they were performing manual tasks using hand tools. And the fourth one, I forget now, they were recent employees. So the conclusion of that study was that smoking causes a lack of brain oxygenation and somehow works like sleep deprivation in people make faulty decisions as a result of consuming tobacco. The others are self-explanatory. If you're physically inactive and you're just clumsy, I mean, that's just the nature of it. You're going to have more frequent events like that. The mechanical tasks are explained by repetition and ergonomic issues. So you can engineer a lot of those processes out of your business and avoid pitfall number 5. The other part of encouraging return to work is be open to accommodating injured workers. So when a physician says return to work light duty, you don't have the attitude, hey, there's no light duty at this place, it's all heavy work, you can see for yourself. Try to figure out exactly what light duty means to that physician. And you may want you or the safety professional or HR to call that provider and just have that elaborated on a little bit more. And suggest, one way I try to educate employers is get the provider to set activity restrictions. That's really his role as a healer, is to make a diagnosis and to establish a treatment plan. And in that process, he tells his injured worker, hey, I don't want you putting your hand above your head more often than you need to. Because if you do that, that may delay healing. It's not an absolute restriction that I never want you to put your hand above your head again. It's just, and it's not immediately going to result in aggravation of his injury. It just means, that's a restriction I'd prefer you not do. It's also 24/7. It doesn't just apply at work, it applies at home. And if you do it, it may delay healing. So when you hear that from a provider, you might suggest some type of work to the provider. Do you think Joe can come back if I had him sit in the trailer and act as the security guard? He may have to do some paper filing. He might have to lift a box, 20 pounds from time to time. And typically the provider would sign off on something like that. So getting that person back to work in that capacity would be a huge, huge win for you, and would reduce the cost of that case, but would also prevent it from migrating in the other direction and having him out of work for months, sometimes years, with no real benefit. Medicalization, as I explained, is using medical condition as an avoidance. It starts, I believe, early in life when, you imagine, your child has homework assignment, and he says, Mom, I have a headache, I don't think I can do my homework assignment. And you being a very empathetic mother, wanting the best for little Johnny, write him a note saying, give this to your school teacher, and you'll, be relieved of having to do that assignment. That's very much medicalization in later life. People use conditions such as headaches, back pain, shoulder pain, etc., to avoid living up to certain obligations. A lot of it is psychosocial driven. A lot of it is depression. A lot of it is anxiety manifesting as physical complaints. But a lot of it can be just behavioral issues, such as a challenging home environment, or the kids using drugs, or husband gambling, or husband usually abusing alcohol, or the wife having an affair. All of these things become medical problems, and if the person has a work injury, and this as a background, it's going to be a disaster. Those are the typical cases that I see that have charts this big, that are in medical treatment for years, that are having multiple operations, all of them of no benefit, and really nobody ever addressed the fundamental issue at the outset. These are the situations that drive employers crazy. So one of the ways to avoid this is obviously to have what we call an employee assistance program. An employee assistance program is a part of your medical benefit package, I'm sure, that you offer, which is access telephonically to a psychologist for 6 counseling sessions. It's typically free to the employee, but you know what? Nobody ever is aware of it, and nobody promotes it, nobody supports it. But it is the best way and a great tool for helping you manage some of the troubling issues that tend to occur in your work environment. And it's, again, it wouldn't be appropriate for a safety professional to bring these issues up to a medical professional, but you could engage another medical professional to do what we call a peer-to-peer. I'm doing one right now for an employer in the Bay Area. This person was a great employee, went out of work about a year ago for an ankle fracture, and has not returned to work yet. The typical healing time for an ankle fracture is about 12 weeks. So they have a very dedicated disease management, case management process within this employer. And the employer, this disease case manager, became aware that she was the victim of domestic abuse. And so they engaged me. They heard about this third party, so they couldn't necessarily call the provider at themselves. So they engaged me to reach out to the provider to inform the provider, in case he was not aware, that this sort of was the home life situation, and to have him consider whether or not those factors had more to do with her failure to recovery than the actual ankle issues themselves. I haven't necessarily been successful in engaging him. I've left a couple of messages, but that is one of the ways you could get some of these issues addressed. Fraud does occur. It occurs on all levels. It occurs at the employer level. It occurs at the insurance company level. And it's not outright fraud. It's more what I call abuse. It occurs of employees. They start out having knee pain, and they're just about getting recovered from that, and then their hip starts to bother them, and then their ankle starts to bother them. I would think it's more, I have seen overt fraud. It accounts for about 3% of all workers' comp claims. What I think is a more difficult situation and a more realistic abuse is the unrealistic expectations on the part of injured workers, where they think they have hit the gravy train or the jackpot once they have an injury and are put out of work. They tend to magnify the symptoms and delay recovery in that process and stay on disability payroll. Again, it's tax-free for longer than necessary. So what employers have done to address this pitfall is explain rights to the injured workers so that they fully understand what to expect, and have a return-to-work program can help address unrealistic expectations. I've said this a number of times, and I'll say it once more. Return to work helps injured workers deal a lot with the mental issues that occur by being out of work. I have a saying that a worker who is out of work for 6 weeks will develop depression. So now you're dealing with back pain on top of depression. And if it was not the depression that put the person out of work to begin with, they will develop depression if they're out of work for 6 weeks. So you have to get it addressed at some point. And that's what I see in the treating community, is providers fail to address these mental health issues that occur simultaneously or are there as a background to these injured workers. And employers add to that by not having an accommodative process and returning these employees to some sort of work. Because when you're out of work for 6 weeks, it promotes self-indulgence, and you have a lack of self-worth. And it drives you down this slippery slope into bad depression. So avoiding pitfall number 8 is having a meaningful return-to-work policy. I have major employers who hire return to work coordinators, just to work with supervisors in trying to get people back to work, because they have fully gotten the message of how harmful being out of work just really is. Number 9 pitfall is ineffective use of case management. Most of your insurance companies have case management as part of your insurance plan. It tends to not be deployed, and it tends to be ineffective. A case manager is best considered like a concierge. In this hotel, we have a concierge desk. They'll get you movie tickets. They'll get you tickets to the Royals. Don't know why you'd want to go, but, they'll get you them if you want. That's a concierge. Similarly, a return-to-work coordinator, concierge, case manager, that's what they do. They'll get you doctor's appointments. They'll get your prescriptions filled. They'll get work restrictions clarified. They'll deal with unaccommodating supervisors. They'll be your advocate if you're an injured worker in helping you manage through the system. And the people who have this deployed effectively litigate less, return to work more frequently, and the cost of these cases are much, much less than cases that do not have it. And finally, number 10, I know we're out of time, is pitfall number 10, and lack of innovation. And this is the traditional approach I see in all of America. Employee comes to the supervisor and says, my back hurts, my neck hurts. Supervisor says, well, what you want me to do? I'm not a doctor. Why don't you go to the medical clinic? And what's wrong with that scenario is that it leads to overutilization of medical services and costs a lot of money. On the other hand, I see supervisors who say, there's nothing wrong with you, go back to work, shrug it off, man up. That's the supervisor becoming the treating physician. So I developed this military triage process, and we have a call center in Salt Lake City. I'm not alone, so this is not an advertisement, but it was in response to this employer's request back in the 90s, and we use this SPICE model. So when an injury occurs, the injured worker goes to the supervisor, reports the event. The supervisor no longer has to make the decision if care is necessary or not. They pick up the phone, they call a nurse in Salt Lake City. She's there 24/7. There's about 30 of them. We'll take 30,000 calls this year. And they put through this simple triage process. The SPICE stands for simplicity. Simple issues handled in a complicated fashion inevitably become complicated. And that's what we're doing in the workers' comp system. We're making trivial injuries very complicated by doing a lot of tests, doing a lot of pain management, keeping people out of work. And we're confusing the employee, and the employers think it's fraud. It's not. We've just created that process. So the military use SPICE to keep things simple. Back pain is back pain. It's not a herniated disc. They keep the treatment proximate to where the injury occurred. When I went to this chicken processing, they have a 24/7 nurse at that plant because, again, it's probably 20 minutes to a provider, and they want the people treated at work because they understand the implications of this model. I is immediate. Get treatment immediately. So you want employees to report every event. You want to have a process for managing it and make an immediate call or do something immediately to remedy the situation. Centrality, I talked about earlier. Everybody needs to be on the same page, have the same message when dealing with injured workers. And finally, expectant, setting expectations. Yes, you have had a boo-boo. That's unfortunate. We're going to repair the process, and we need to get you attended to. But it's not a reason for you to be out of work. Of the 30,000 calls we'll take this year, 70% of them elect self-care. They never go to a provider. They use ice, Advil, elevation. They return to work, and they get better. And they stay outside of the workers' comp system. And it's extremely beneficial because it helps employers manage the process. I'm not going to deal with it more. One other area of innovation we've added, if I could find it, is telehealth, bringing to rural communities, bringing the physician to the work site through the use of technology. So instead of having to run out to an emergency room, you can get on an iPad, and if that physician is licensed in the state that you're operating, they can do a FaceTime intervention and consult on that injured worker and keep them at work. Okay, that's the prepared comments. If we have time for questions, not sure. I think I might have gone over.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any questions? Go ahead.
How do you deal with non-English speaking workers?
How do I deal with
Non-English speaking workers?
Habla español. That's a very good question. You do need to, we have a translation service in our triage model. And when I had a clinic, I employed 4 or 5 people who spoke Spanish. I learned a lot of medical terminology, Spanish myself, because being able to relate is really critical with the Hispanic community. To the cultural issues here on their side are really important. They don't like ice. They've been brought up to believe that if it's hot outside, using ice, they're going to develop pneumonia. I'm serious, So a lot of these cultural practices have to be addressed. They think every ache and pain is a broken bone. Again, it's cultural. So they're going to want to see x-rays. That's what I learned in dealing with. I did a lot of housekeepers that were all Hispanic in Anaheim. So use the translation service. Try to find providers who speak Spanish. I'm sure there are other languages that need to be addressed. I know the workforce I was dealing with the other night used a lot of Afghan refugees. So there's a lot of Cantonese, etc.
One quick question. How do you think the new OSHA severe injury reporting is going to affect our businesses?
I'm sort of only peripherally aware of that. I knew that there was OSHA were going to address first aid cases a year ago and wanted to have greater reporting of all injuries, including first aids. And somehow that got delayed for now. But the severe reporting, is that related to amputation, hospitalization?
Yeah, OSHA changed. It's like now you have to report any hospitalization within 8 hours. And before it was previously it was 3.
And those, again, my remarks are not addressed to those severe events because those don't contribute to the overall cost structure. 80% of the cost is related to 20% of the injuries, and they're typically the ones that spiral out of control that should have returned to work that are driving up the cost. I think that I see a lot of cases. Say, for example, I have back pain and I end up having surgery 6 months later. That wouldn't be an OSHA call. That's not a hospitalization. They're talking about hospitalizations from an immediate event. And then you have 8 hours to call your OSHA so that they can get on site and do their inspection.
Well, thank you, Peter. I'd like everyone to give Peter a hand for this very informative.